I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, a preventable tragedy in Lewiston, Maine. I'll talk to a co-founder of Mass General Hospital's Gun Violence Prevention Center and an expert on firearm violence prevention on the realities of mass shootings like this one and what actions this country finally needs to take to keep this from happening over and over and over again. Then we'll take a look at the controversial new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and what his appointment signals for the future of Congress. It has happened again. At least 18 people have been massacred in yet another American mass shooting. This time, a gunman opened fire with an AR-style weapon in a bar and a bowling alley in Lewiston, Maine, before taking off, sending authorities on a manhunt, and putting the city and the surrounding area in lockdown. At the time of this taping, police and other law enforcement agencies are still looking for the shooter. And people in and around Lewiston are just beginning to grapple with what just happened in their community. I'm joined now by someone who knows the realities of mass shootings like these all too well. Dr. Chana Sacks is a physician and the co-director of Mass General Hospital's Center for Gun Violence Prevention. I'm also joined by David Hemenway, a professor of health policy at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Chana, David, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for asking us.
This is a tragedy that we experience all too often in this country, just over and over again. And not to be flip, but it's possible that no one captured the helplessness we all feel better than The Onion, which runs a headline after every single one of these massacres. Onion headline, "No way to prevent this," says only nation where this regularly happens.
And that's true. It's so sad that every other country, and particularly every other high-income country, does so much better than we do about guns and gun violence. So I teach at the Chan School of Public Health, and there's so many international students, and they just cannot understand how we as adults let this happen over and over, particularly to our children.
Chana?
Yeah, I mean, I think that says it so well. It's just so tragic that we're here again together to talk about the aftermath and talk about what we know comes next.
So David, you said that we're the only country where this happens. I think it's worth putting some numbers behind that. So, gun homicides per 100,000 people around the world in 2019. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation Small Arms Survey. The United States is 4.12. So 4.1 Americans out of every 100,000 are killed by guns every year in 2019. In Israel, it's 1.05. In Canada, it's 0.5. In Australia, it's 0.18. Norway, 0.07. The UK, 0.04. And Japan, 0.02. So let's put that in perspective. That means that the gun homicide rate in the United Kingdom is 1/1000th that in the United States. In Japan, it's 1/2000th that of the United States. So what is it that they're doing right that we are doing so wrong?
It doesn't seem to be anything to do with violent video games. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with mental health. It has to do with guns. We make guns readily available. And remember, we're only talking about high-income countries here now. There are other countries which do worse, which are at civil war and so forth, and don't have police forces that are very good. But in terms of all the other high-income countries, we have by far the most guns, and particularly we have handguns, and we also have military weapons, and we have by far the weakest gun laws. So we let virtually anybody get any kind of gun they want very easily. And it means that, not surprisingly, we get lots of problems with guns. And if you want to, one of the things is to recognize is that if we learn from other countries, we don't just, it's not just one country we could learn from. If we just picked any other of the 30 plus other high-income countries and did what they were doing about guns, we would be much better off.
And as stark as those numbers are, when you share them, as stark as those numbers are, when you just look at deaths, which is how we count the toll of gun violence in this country, that's a drastic underestimate of the full impact that we experience. When you think of what happened yesterday in Lewiston, we're gonna remember this shooting tragically by the number of people who died, but the number of people who are affected, whose lives were changed yesterday, the number of people that are family members of those that are physically injured or will have or will experience this trauma and emotional distress and other things that impact it. Every single person injured or killed by a gun has many family members and friends and colleagues and other people that are affected. And when you start to think about the toll of gun violence in that way, it really shows that those numbers you just shared, they're stark and they're a drastic underestimate of the impact of gun violence in communities across this country.
Gun, as Chana was saying, gun violence, the trauma from gun violence leads to a really increased risk for all sorts of problems in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health through your whole life.
So let's put you're both experts on public health, so help me put this in perspective. In terms of threats to public health in the United States, where does gun violence rank?
If you're just looking at deaths, it's not nearly the highest in terms of deaths. It's heart disease, which kills most people, but it's mostly old people. Cancer kills a lot of people, mostly old people. What gun violence does is not only, though, kill people, and it kills lots of young people, but as Chana was saying, it's more than just somebody falling down and getting a hip fracture and dying, which is terrible. But gun violence can affect the entire community. Gun violence in a lot of cities in the United States really affects the whole community. It means that it's really hard for the community to thrive and to grow. People are afraid to go out. Companies are afraid to come in. It has really devastating effects. So just looking at, this is only killing whatever it is, 40,000 people a year or something, that's really not the best or the only way to look at this. And it's clearly so preventable because, again, you can look at any other high-income country and they've prevented it in some way, and they haven't prevented it because they have fewer people with mental health problems or fewer people who get angry or fewer people who get drunk or fewer people who have beat their spouses. It's all seems to have to do with firearms and the way we treat firearms in the United States.
So I want to focus in on that a little bit because it seems to me that the counter arguments that are always proposed, that this is not about guns, in a real sense, they would say something much worse about the United States, right? So like if it's about mental illness, that means that to believe that, you would have to believe that the United States is the only developed country where people have psychiatric problems. That would say something pretty awful about this country, right?
It certainly would.
So if the story is that this is about gun violence and the magnitude is, as you said, 40,000, and I just want to build on that a little bit because the United States is about to drop out of the top 50 in life expectancy among countries, which, a statistic that it is hard to imagine that the wealthiest country in human history would be not in the top 50. How much of that is because gun violence by killing the young disproportionately lowers?
That's one of there's lots of reasons for that. We don't have a very good safety net in the United States. The United States is different from other countries a lot in terms of policies. It's hard to say we're that different in terms of people because so many people from the whole rest of the world came to the United States. We are an immigrant country. So it's not like, oh my goodness, we're that different, but we are really different in terms of the way we treat people who have issues, who have been unlucky in life, and we don't help them as much as one might hope.
Chana, there's a lot of variation in gun laws in this country, and there's a lot of variation in gun crime in this country. Can you help us understand what the relationship between those two might tell us about gun laws and what works?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a clinician, sometimes I think about it a little bit differently. Of course, as David's saying, we have an opportunity to look at what works by looking at what other countries are doing, what certain states here are doing. But even states that have the strictest gun laws, we live and work in Massachusetts, a state that has the strictest gun laws in the country, among the strictest gun laws in the country. And still, in communities right here in Boston, if you're in Dorchester, in Roxbury, in Mattapan, when I work with community organizations that are on the front lines of this issue every day, communities right here, even where there are strict gun laws, are confronting this issue every single day. and it often goes unreported or undiscussed. And I think that's just really important to remember. A lot of times we do this work and people say, why are you doing it in Boston? Is there even a problem here in Boston? And I just think it's really important that we understand deeply that this affects people across this country, even as if Massachusetts were compared to other countries, as David is pointing out, we're still not doing well enough. And that's right here with a lot of the strictest gun laws. And I think that's just a really important framing as we're thinking about what we need to do. It's yes, there are absolutely more gun laws that would make a difference here, but the problem is deeper than that and goes beyond it. And I think that those are really important issues to discuss.
And one of the big things to recognize too is that one of the reasons, in terms of total amounts of gun deaths per capita, Massachusetts is typically the best state or the second best state. We always do very well because we have stronger gun laws and we don't have that many guns, though a lot of people are able to have guns. One of our big problems is we would do much better, except that our crime guns are largely imported from states around us that have very weak gun laws. So, I know if you live in New York City, like over 90% of the guns used in crime were not initially purchased in New York State, let alone New York City. In Boston, I think something like 2/3 of the guns come from out of state and the other third come from Western Massachusetts. And so if we were surrounded by other states which had stronger gun laws, we would do much better. The same way they are bad neighbors to us, the United States is a terrible neighbor to countries around us. If you ask, how do Canadian criminals get guns? Well, they don't get them nearly as many as the United States criminals can get, but they get them from the United States. How do Mexican cartels get guns? They get them from the United States. And so not only are we hurting ourselves, but we are hurting our neighbors, which is just so horrible.
Chana, you said you're doing the work in the communities. So in the absence of gun legislation, what does that work look like?
Thanks for asking that question. And I think it raises the point. If we pass different gun laws tomorrow, there are still right now more guns than people in this country. And I think that's part of the reality that we have to contend with. One of the things I focus on, I'm a clinician, a physician. I think a lot about how do we take better care of people who have suffered from this type of violence, both directly as a result of these physical injuries and indirectly, as David was just talking about, that there are downstream effects. We are good in this country, in many of our health systems, at repairing the immediate injuries from a bullet. But what about those hidden wounds? What about the impact on family members? How do we improve our trauma-informed care? How do we center the experiences of people who have been most affected by this trauma? And it can help us better understand what kind of resources, for example, we need to wrap around people who have gone through this, communities that are going through this, and to do this better. So that's a lot of the work that we do, really trying to improve the trauma-informed care, really trying to also think upstream in terms of prevention. How do we recognize people who are potentially at risk and understand how to have culturally competent, relevant conversations with our patients who might be at risk for gun injuries, and improve firearm safety storage, improve people's recognition of other people who might be at risk, and think about creating those conditions that when somebody's in a moment of crisis, we can temporarily get those guns out of that home. Not because of a law says so necessarily, but because we live in a community that looks out for each other, recognizes when people are at risk, and we create the conditions to take care of each other in our community in that way.
This is the first time I've covered a mass shooting. It will not be the last, I say with certainty, and I cannot imagine a more tragic note to end our story than that. Chana, David, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for asking us.
For having us.
Next up, 3 weeks, several votes, and many failed candidates later, the House finally has a new speaker, and his name is Mike Johnson. The Republican from Louisiana won support from all 217 of his GOP colleagues in the House. But that hardly means he's a uniting figure. Johnson is a staunch Trump ally and is facing renewed scrutiny for his role in the 2020 legal battles designed to overturn the results of the presidential election. So why did the GOP rally behind him? And what does his appointment mean for this country as it reels from the latest mass shooting? To discuss, I'm joined by Michael Astrue, former Associate Counsel to George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, and former Commissioner of Social Security for George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Mike, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, what does Mike Johnson say about the Republican Party in the House?
Well, I think the important thing, I know there'll be many viewers who aren't necessarily thrilled about all of this, but in the short run, I think this is great news for the country because there are three incredibly important things for the country and the world that have been held up by the disarray. One is support for Israel, one is support for Ukraine, and the other is the shutting down of the government. And to finally be able to put the squabbling aside and deal with the issues that really matter, because now we have a speaker, that almost everybody has to view that as good news, I think.
So let me focus in on Ukraine first,
Yeah.
because Mike Johnson's score on supporting Ukraine, one of the think tanks gave him, was an F,
Right.
Like as bad as it was possible to get.
Right.
So is he actually going to negotiate on supporting Ukraine with the administration?
He signals he would. Now, I agree that his original score based on his original position was an F, and he earned that F. But he has signaled something very different in the last 6-12 months or so, and I think there's a reasonable chance that he will be supportive of appropriate support for Ukraine. But even if he isn't, I think there's enough support in the House that just getting it on the floor and getting it moving is going to be enough to get the help to where we need to get it.
So is it possible to get a House Ukraine resolution on the floor of the House if the Speaker is opposed to it?
Difficult. But, I don't have the sense that Johnson is the kind of person that's going to say, if I personally don't agree with it, it can't get to the floor. I think that he is a better person than that. I think he's a bigger picture person than that. And I think he'll say, okay, I may vote against the resolution, but this is something that everybody in the House deserves a chance to vote on. And I think he'll do that.
So that's good news for Ukraine.
Yes.
But Mike Johnson's sort of only prominence in the Republican Party, as far as I can tell, comes from his support for the attempts to overturn the election in 2020. In particular, he was sort of the legal ringleader of that effort. He may have been, in fact, one of the single most key figure in putting together some of the lawsuits that were eventually thrown out by the Supreme Court. What does it say about not just the Republican Party, but sort of the future of the country, that the number 3 person in the line of succession publicly attempted to overturn an election?
Yeah, so I have divided feelings about this. So I was critical of that at the time. I'm critical of it now. On the other hand, I think it's a lot clearer in hindsight than it was at the time. And I'm not sure that he would take some of the same positions today. It's also, there's some real unfairness here because Democratic members of the House have challenged by voting against electors every single Republican win since George Bush had a landslide against Michael Dukakis.
I'm just going to push you on that, Mike, because the occasional symbolic vote is very, very different from the President of the United States organizing a conspiracy that includes actual violence to overturn a government.
I'm not justifying anything that, you know me well enough,
Yeah.
I'm not justifying anything that Donald Trump has done. I'm looking at what Mike Johnson did. And what Mike Johnson did, which I disagree with, is that he voted against some of the electors that were presented after the election. And I think that was a wrong decision. But on the other hand, as I said, it's happened before. It's happened with a lot of Democrats. One of our senators did it in 2005, Ed Markey. So, it's something I don't agree with, but I don't think it's, at this point, disqualifying.
So I'm not going to ask you to defend something that you don't agree with, Mike, but I'll just to keep pushing on that. He didn't just vote against the electors, right? He organized the legal challenge that was clearly specious, and he spread and continued to spread the conspiracy theories about Dominion voting machines being rigged that, it might be clearer at the time now because we have the text from Fox News, but everyone who was paying any attention at the time knew that this was a lunatic conspiracy theory.
Well, I'm not sure that everybody did. You have to realize, again, to try to go back to January, most members of Congress don't know how to turn on their own computer. So you say there was massive fraud through systems that they don't understand. They have to, look to others to figure out, is this true or is this not? And so, what a lot of them did is they acted on very poor advice. And Mike Johnson acted on very poor advice. And again, I don't want to get into a huge defensive, all this. I wish that he'd had the judgment to behave in a different way. But on the other hand, I don't think it's disqualifying because there are an awful lot of Democrats that would have to be disqualified under that same standard.
So to step away from the election for a moment, we have also the questions of, I guess, policy, but also what it means for 2024. In which context, Mike Johnson has made some pretty remarkable statements about abortion rights in particular. And so we have some tape on that.
Think about the implications of that on the economy. We're all struggling here to cover the bases of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and all the rest. If we had all those able-bodied workers in the economy, we wouldn't be going upside down and toppling over like this. Listen,
the gentleman
I will not yield. I will not. Roe was a terrible corruption of America's constitutional jurisprudence.
So Mike, Mike Johnson appears to be a congressman who was who's sort of most prominent on attacking the 2020 election and overturning Roe v. Wade. These are issues that have not been served the Republican Party well for the last couple of years. Do they really want to run behind someone who that's their position?
I think the answer to that question, quite frankly, is yes. I think that where Johnson is pretty close to where the majority of the Republican House members are today. I think he's a little to the right of that consensus, but no, not particularly far off. So we were going to get somebody, if we were going to get a speaker, which we desperately needed to do, we were going to get someone in this zone on these social issues.
So he definitely is, I buy that he's representative of House Republicans, but views of this sort of stringency on abortion, for example, where he has argued that he has advocated for laws where abortions would not be legal at 0 weeks, right? Like there is no point where that. They are not even representative of the majority of Republicans, much less the majority of Americans. So is this going to have consequences in 2024?
Well, you look at the polls on abortion and they're all over the map, and it depends a lot on how you ask the question. I wish I could recall the polling organization, but there was a polling organization, if I remember correctly, that went, instead of asking the question directly and looking at aggregate numbers, asked more of the question of how likely are you to vote on this single issue? And the answer, if I remember correctly, was pretty small and pretty equal on both sides of the question. So my view for a long time, which maybe is wrong, but my view is that it doesn't make a lot of difference in most of the presidential campaigns, that it's something that we are fiercely split about as a nation. And, elections, I think, get decided on other issues. I'm kind of with Bill Clinton on this, in that I think it's usually about the economy.
So that was true before Dobbs, but after Dobbs, we've seen sort of Democratic outperformance in off-year elections, and not just sort of doing better than you expect Democrats to do, but consistently beating the polls. Where the only thing I can come up with that makes sense with that is abortion rights.
Oh, but there are other things that you can come up with that make sense for that. And I think in general, what you're seeing is a negative reaction to former President Trump and some of the things that are going, the criminal prosecutions, some of the other things that are associated with former President Trump. And so I don't think there's anything really that would connect those defeats with the social issues. I think it's more, the leader of your party is under indictment in how many states and, for this, that, and the other thing. And I think that that's what's hurting Republican candidates more than anything else.
So if that's true, then should we expect Speaker Johnson, who's, it seems to have been helped over the top by endorsement from Donald Trump, members of the House have been agitating for cutting off funding to the Justice Department in order to stop the prosecutions. Should we expect him to support something like that?
I don't think so. At the end of the day, he's a lawyer. I think he takes the rule of law seriously. I think he knows my guess is that he knows the chaos that would happen if you actually tried to defund the Justice Department. Now, if you did some retaliatory cuts, that happens. Democrats have done that, Republicans have done that, and the world goes on. But something hugely dramatic, like you're talking about, I just don't see him signing on to anything that reckless.
So then, sort of as a final question then, what does it say about the Republican Party that essentially a relatively small handful of the most radical Republicans, led by Matt Gaetz, of all people, were able to overthrow a Speaker of the House and replace him with someone who was far more sympathetic to their own views?
Yep.
Having exerted that power, it seems unlikely to me that this will be the last time they do it.
Yes, I think one of the risks in this situation is that Speaker Johnson's service could be short, and he could do a splendid job and just become a target for people that a very small minority that can, throw everything into chaos again. And I think that that is a very possible scenario. I hope that Speaker Johnson develops in office and surprises a lot of people with the broader perspective that he takes on issues. And I hope that some of the people causing the difficulty in the House calm down a little bit and realize that the country and the world have big problems and we have to face up to them like professionals.
So we're taping this the day after this awful massacre in Lewiston, Maine. Is there any chance that there's going to be any kind of meaningful gun reform coming out of this House?
I suppose it depends on your definition of meaningful. There is, I know from a failed exercise in the Obama administration, that there are a set of things that you can do that bring a fair number of Republicans on board as well. Keeping guns out of the hands of people with proven mental illness, with records of violence, including domestic violence and that kind of thing. There is some area on that, but probably what most gun control advocates would consider serious legislation, I think the answer is probably no.
Michael Astrue, thanks for joining us. That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Adam Riley and his panel will dig into new data that shows Governor Healey is receiving poor grades on housing and transportation from Massachusetts residents. Plus, one-on-one interviews with John Fitzgerald and Joel Richards, the candidates vying to replace Frank Baker's seat in the Boston City Council. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Gautam Mukunda, and good night.